It all started innocently enough, or at least that's what I told myself. Being a professional football player, I was used to the pressure, the grueling schedule, and the temptations that came with the lifestyle. I thought I could handle it all. But I never imagined that the hardest part would come from someone so close to home. My wife, Emily, was a rugby player, tough as nails and just as dedicated to her sport as I was to mine. We were the perfect match, or at least that's what everyone thought. Our relationship was built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared athletic passions, and understanding the demands of each other's careers. We'd often train together in the mornings before our schedules took us in different directions. I could never tire of seeing her push herself to the limit, sweat glistening on her brow as she moved with agility and power. There was something so magnetic about her when she was in her element. I was proud of her, of us. We were the couple everyone admired. But admiration doesn't stop temptation. It was during one of those training sessions when I first met Sophie. She had recently joined Emily's team, a promising young forward with the energy and determination of someone who was ready to make a name for herself. She was different from Emily, younger and a little wilder, with a mischievous glint in her eye that was impossible to ignore. At first, I didn't pay her much attention, but as time went on, I started to notice the subtle ways she'd glance at me when she thought no one was looking, the playful banter that felt just a little too flirtatious. I should have walked away then, put some distance between us. But instead, I found myself intrigued, curious about what might lie behind those lingering stares and suggestive smiles. I'd catch myself thinking about her at the most inconvenient times, during workouts, on the field, even when Emily and I were together. It was like a game that had started without me realizing I was playing. I was drifting, and Sophie was pulling me in closer with every glance and coy laugh. One evening, after a particularly tough practice session for Emily's team, she suggested we all go out for drinks. It seemed like a harmless idea. I knew the other girls on her team pretty well, and it wasn't unusual for us to hang out socially. But that night was different. Maybe it was the way Sophie laughed at my jokes a little too enthusiastically, or how she found excuses to brush against me in the crowded bar. I could feel the electricity, the chemistry, strong and undeniable. The drinks kept flowing that night, and the atmosphere was buzzing. Emily was engaged in a lively conversation with a few of her teammates, and I found myself standing by the bar, alone with Sophie. It didn't feel intentional at first, it just happened. But the longer we stood there, talking and laughing, the less I felt like walking away. We were deep into a conversation about sports injuries and the toll they took on our bodies. It was a topic I knew all too well, and so did she. Her green eyes sparkled with interest as she listened intently, occasionally leaning in closer to hear me over the noise. Her hand brushed my arm as she reached for her drink, and a shiver ran through me. Then, without thinking, I found myself reaching out, my hand resting briefly on her lower back as I leaned in to tell her something. It was a touch so casual that it could have meant nothing. But it did mean something. There was a spark, a jolt of excitement that shot through me when my fingers grazed the fabric of her shirt. I pulled back, reminding myself that Emily was only a few feet away. But Sophie's gaze didn't falter. If anything, it seemed to challenge me, daring me to see how far this could go. The night wound down, and eventually we all headed our separate ways. Emily and I walked back to our apartment, hand in hand, as she recapped the highlights of her day. I listened, responding appropriately, but my thoughts were a blur, lingering on the feeling of Sophie's touch and the way her eyes had locked onto mine. That night, as Emily and I lay in bed, I couldn't help but feel the weight of my guilt. There was nothing physical that had happened between Sophie and me, nothing concrete. But the desire was there, simmering just beneath the surface. I turned over and wrapped my arm around Emily, as if to reassure myself that this was where I belonged. I was committed to her. She was my wife, my partner, my equal. Yet, a part of me couldn't shake the idea that I had already crossed an invisible line, and I wasn't sure if I could go back. The following weeks were a whirlwind of games, training sessions, and social events. But amidst all the chaos, Sophie seemed to be everywhere. I'd see her on the sidelines when I came to watch Emily's practices, or at the gym where the team trained. We'd exchange brief glances and polite nods, always careful not to linger too long. But those unspoken moments grew heavier with each encounter, laden with a tension that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. One day, Emily had to stay late after practice for a strategy meeting with her coach. She asked me to stick around and wait for her, but as I wandered around the training facility, I ran into Sophie in the hallway. She was cooling down from her workout, her hair damp with sweat and her cheeks flushed. She flashed me a smile and walked over, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. "Hey, didn't expect to see you here," she said. Her voice casual, but her eyes saying something else entirely. I shrugged. "Emily's still in a meeting, so I'm just hanging around." "Ah, lucky me," she replied, the corner of her mouth curling into a teasing grin. "I get some extra company." I laughed, trying to keep it light, but there was an undercurrent of something dangerous in our exchange. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing in particular, just idle chatter. But then she tilted her head and gave me a look that was more direct than usual. "You know," she said slowly, "I've been meaning to ask you something. You're always so serious. Do you ever just let loose?" Her question took me by surprise. "I guess that depends on what you mean by letting loose," I replied, half joking. "I mean, letting go of all this," she gestured around the empty gym, "and having some fun. I've seen you on the field. There's more to you than just football." The way she said it sent a thrill through me, and I knew I was on the brink of something I wouldn't be able to take back. We were walking a fine line, and I could feel the ground slipping beneath my feet. It wasn't long after that when Emily mentioned she'd be traveling for an away game. She'd be gone for the weekend, and I had my own match scheduled, so it seemed like a perfect time for us to focus on our sports and catch up when she returned. As I kissed her goodbye before she left for the team bus, a pang of guilt gnawed at me. I knew I was about to make a choice that could change everything. The weekend arrived, and after my game, I was exhausted, but the restless energy from the field was still coursing through me. I ended up at a bar near the stadium, a place where I knew some of Emily's teammates hung out. I had told myself I was just grabbing a drink to unwind, but a part of me hoped to run into Sophie. Sure enough, as I stepped inside, there she was, sitting with a couple of girls from the team. When she saw me, her face lit up, and she waved me over. The other girls greeted me warmly, but as the night went on, they started to leave one by one, until it was just me and Sophie. We stayed at the bar, talking and laughing for hours. She leaned closer with each passing minute, her touch lingering longer, her words filled with an unspoken promise. I kept telling myself it was innocent, just two people enjoying each other's company. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Eventually, we found ourselves outside, the cold night air wrapping around us as we stood there in silence. She looked up at me, her breath visible in the chill, and in that moment, everything else faded away. I reached out and pulled her close, and before I could second-guess myself, my lips were on hers. The kiss was explosive, years of restraint shattered in an instant. Her hands gripped my shoulders as she leaned into me, and I was lost in the sensation of her body pressed against mine. But just as quickly as it started, I pulled back, reality crashing down on me. This can't happen," I said, my voice shaking. Sophie took a step back, her expression unreadable. "Maybe it already did," she whispered, then turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding and my mind racing. After that kiss, everything changed. I thought it would be easy to move on, to put the moment behind me and pretend it never happened. But Sophie was like a wildfire that I couldn't contain. The more I tried to push the memory away, the more it consumed me. I found myself thinking about her constantly, about the feel of her lips on mine, the look in her eyes, and the thrill of being so close to the edge. It was like a secret I carried, a spark that kept burning no matter how hard I tried to snuff it out. When Emily came back from her away game, I tried to act like everything was normal. I greeted her with a kiss, asked about the game, and listened as she told me about the highlights. But there was a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, a sense of guilt and a fear that she could somehow see right through me. I wondered if she noticed the way my touch lingered just a little bit too long or how my gaze would occasionally drift off. I told myself I had to put distance between Sophie and me to stop this before it got any further. But fate, or perhaps my own weakness, had other plans. Sophie and I kept running into each other at the gym, at social events with the team, and even at places where I least expected her to be. Every time our eyes met, it was like an unspoken invitation, a dangerous game where both of us were the players. One afternoon, after a workout at the gym, I was heading to the locker room when Sophie appeared in the hallway. She wasn't supposed to be there. It was supposed to be a day off for Emily's team. But there she was, as if she had been waiting for me. She walked over, her expression somewhere between a smirk and a challenge. "Looks like you just can't get rid of me," she said, her voice laced with amusement. I forced a smile, trying to keep things light. "Just a coincidence, right?" "Maybe," she replied, taking a step closer. "Or maybe you're looking for an excuse to run into me." The air between us crackled with tension. I knew I should have walked away, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning against the wall, looking at her with the same intensity that I'd tried so hard to suppress. It was as if the distance I'd been trying to put between us only made the pull stronger. Before I knew it, she was right in front of me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her skin. "You know," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "you don't have to pretend with me." The way she said it, soft and inviting, broke down what little resolve I had left. I reached out and took her hand, pulling her into the empty locker room. As the door closed behind us, I felt a rush of adrenaline and guilt, but neither was enough to stop me. I kissed her again, harder this time, with a hunger that I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. It was reckless, dangerous, and undeniably thrilling. For a few breathless minutes, it was just us, lost in each other and in the forbidden nature of what we were doing. But as soon as it was over, reality crashed back down on me like a tidal wave. I pulled away, breathless and shaken. "This can't happen again," I said, my voice ragged. "Emily." Sophie looked up at me, her expression calm and composed. "I'm not asking you to leave her," she said. "This doesn't have to be complicated. Just don't lie to yourself about what you want." The weeks that followed were a blur of deception. I found myself living a double life, constantly switching between being the devoted husband and the man who stole moments with Sophie in secret. It was exhilarating and exhausting all at once. I'd wake up in the mornings next to Emily, feeling the weight of my betrayal, only to see Sophie later and feel that same rush of desire. We'd meet in the oddest places: parking lots, quiet parks, and even in the back room of a friend's house during a party. Each time we were together, it felt more intense, more dangerous. I kept telling myself that I had control over the situation, that I could stop at any time. But the truth was, I didn't want to stop. The thrill of it all, the secrecy, the adrenaline, had a grip on me that I wasn't ready to break free from. One night, Emily was at a late practice session, and I found myself at a bar once more, the same place where I had first kissed Sophie. I didn't plan to meet her there, but when I saw her walk in, it felt like fate. We talked as if we were just friends catching up, but the glances we exchanged said otherwise. As the night wore on, we ended up outside in the back alley, hidden from view. She was standing close, her breath visible in the cool night air. I pulled her against me, and this time, there was no hesitation. The kiss was deep and urgent, the kind that came from knowing we had stolen time and that we'd be stealing more soon. But as we pulled away, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye, someone watching from a distance. It was one of Emily's teammates. I didn't know how much she had seen or if she would say anything, but in that instant, a wave of dread washed over me. Sophie noticed my sudden tension and followed my gaze. She stiffened when she saw the girl standing there, a shocked expression on her face. Without saying a word, the girl turned and walked away, leaving us standing there in the dark. "What if she tells Emily?" I said, my voice barely steady. Sophie shrugged, though I could see the concern in her eyes. "We'll deal with it if it happens," she said. "But maybe it's time you asked yourself what you really want." The days that followed were filled with anxiety. I waited for Emily to confront me, but nothing happened. She acted like everything was normal, and I began to wonder if her teammate had decided to keep what she saw to herself. Maybe she didn't want to get involved, or maybe she had her own reasons for staying silent. Whatever the case, it felt like I had narrowly escaped disaster. But the fear didn't go away. I started to see the risks more clearly, to understand that this could all come crashing down at any moment. Yet, despite the danger, I couldn't stay away from Sophie. We kept finding time to be together, even if it meant risking more. There was a part of me that wanted to stop, to go back to being the husband that Emily thought I was. But each time I tried, I found myself falling back into Sophie's arms. Then, one evening, Emily came home earlier than expected. I was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, when she walked in. She looked at me, her expression hard to read. "Hey, everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over and sat down next to me, her eyes fixed on mine. "I need to ask you something," she said, her tone serious. My heart sank. "What's going on?" "One of the girls on the team. She said she saw you with Sophie," Emily said, her voice steady but laced with suspicion. "She didn't give me all the details. But, is there something you need to tell me?" I felt my pulse quicken. The room seemed to close in on me. This was the moment I had dreaded. The moment where I had to decide whether to lie and dig myself deeper, or tell the truth and risk losing everything. As I sat there, my mind raced. Every fiber of my being screamed to deny, to protect what was left of my life with Emily. I could feel her eyes on me, waiting for an answer, and for a moment, I considered confessing. Telling her everything, just to get the weight off my chest. But then the fear of losing her, of destroying the life we had built together, clawed at my throat. "No," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "There's nothing going on. We were just talking. I know Sophie from your team. That's it." Emily's gaze didn't soften. She searched my face, looking for any hint of dishonesty. "So, you're saying there's nothing I should be worried about?" she asked, her tone pointed. "Absolutely nothing," I replied, forcing myself to meet her eyes. "I promise, Em. You know I wouldn't do anything to hurt you." She let out a slow breath, and her shoulders relaxed just slightly. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. It just seemed odd. Like, why would she say that if there wasn't something going on? Maybe she misunderstood, or maybe she was just trying to stir up drama. I said, trying to sound as reasonable as possible. "You know how people can be." Emily hesitated, then finally nodded. "Yeah, I guess you're right," she said, though there was still a hint of doubt in her voice. "I'm sorry for even bringing it up. It just got to me." I wrapped my arm around her and pulled her close, relieved that she seemed to be letting it go. "You don't have to apologize," I said. "I understand why it would bother you, but I promise, there's nothing to worry about." As she rested her head on my shoulder, I felt a mix of relief and shame. I had managed to convince her, at least for now, but I knew the suspicion would linger. I couldn't keep lying forever. Yet, the pull toward Sophie hadn't weakened. It had only grown stronger, as if the risk made it all the more irresistible. After that confrontation, things grew even more complicated. I became more cautious around Sophie, avoiding any unnecessary encounters in public places. But we didn't stop seeing each other. Instead, our meetings grew more secretive, more calculated. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, worried that someone else might see us or that Emily might ask more questions. Yet, every time I thought about ending things, the desire to be with Sophie overwhelmed my guilt. We began meeting at a small apartment she rented near the city center. It was a place she kept for herself, away from the team and away from anyone who might recognize us. It was perfect, a hideaway where we could forget the rest of the world, even if just for a little while. Those stolen hours together were like an escape. When we were alone, I could let go of the lies, the fear, the constant balancing act. With Sophie, there was no need for pretenses. She didn't ask me to choose between her and Emily. She was content with what we had, even if it was just temporary. And the more time I spent with her, the more I began to question what I really wanted. Then, one evening, after one of our secret meetings, she turned to me with a look I hadn't seen before. You know this can't go on forever, right? She said, her voice soft but firm. I frowned, not understanding where she was going with this. What do you mean? I mean, you're going to have to decide, she said. This in-between thing we're doing, it's only going to get messy, eh? Someone's going to get hurt, and I don't want it to be me. Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. I was living in a fantasy where I thought I could have both women in my life without consequence. But deep down, I knew it was impossible. I had to face reality eventually, and the idea of making a choice scared me more than I wanted to admit. I'm not ready to decide, I said, my voice low. I don't know what I want. Sophie sighed and ran a hand through her hair, frustration clear on her face. Well, you can't have us both forever. You're going to have to make up your mind. And when you do, just be sure it's the right choice. The next few weeks were a blur of tension. Emily noticed my mood swings, my increased absences, and the way I would zone out during conversations. She began to ask more questions, not directly accusing me of anything, but it was clear she was worried. I kept up the charade, reassuring her that everything was fine, but the cracks in my story were starting to show. Then came the day that changed everything. Emily had arranged for us to host a small get-together at our place, a casual gathering with her teammates to celebrate a recent win. I wasn't looking forward to it, knowing that Sophie would be there, but I couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. When she arrived, our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw a flicker of something. Sadness, longing, maybe even resignation. She was polite and distant, never staying close for too long or giving anyone a reason to think there was anything between us. But that only made the tension between us more palpable. As the night wore on, I found myself retreating to the kitchen for a moment of quiet. I was pouring myself a drink when Sophie slipped in behind me, her presence so close that I could feel the warmth of her breath. This is getting unbearable, she whispered, her voice tinged with frustration. I can't keep pretending like we're nothing. Before I could respond, the door swung open, and there stood Emily, staring at us with a look of confusion. What's going on? She asked, her voice sharp. Nothing, I replied quickly, taking a step away from Sophie. We were just talking. But Emily's eyes darted back and forth between us, narrowing as if she was finally seeing the truth. Just talking? She repeated, her tone laced with disbelief. Because it sure didn't look like it. I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet, the moment I had dreaded for so long finally coming to pass. There was no smooth way out of this, no excuse that would erase the suspicion in Emily's eyes. It was time to come clean, or risk losing everything in an instant. The silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity. I could see the questions forming in Emily's mind, the hurt slowly surfacing in her expression. I took a deep breath and decided to face it head-on. Emily, there's something I need to tell you, I said, my voice barely audible. Her eyes widened, and she took a step back as if bracing for a blow. So it's true, she whispered. You and Sophie? I couldn't deny it anymore. Yes, I admitted. It started a few months ago, but I never meant for it to happen. I'm so sorry, Em. The look on her face was one I would never forget. Shock, anger, and betrayal all mixed together. How could you? She shouted, her voice breaking. After everything we've been through, how could you do this to me? I reached out, but she pulled away, tears streaming down her cheeks. Don't, she said. I don't want to hear your excuses. As she turned and stormed out of the room, I was left standing there with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the overwhelming weight of what I had done. I had hurt the one person who trusted me the most, and now there was no taking it back. The days after Emily found out were the darkest I had ever experienced. She left that night, grabbing her things and walking out without looking back. I tried calling her, texting her, apologizing over and over, but my attempts were met with silence. The emptiness of our apartment was suffocating, every corner reminding me of what I had destroyed. I was lost in a haze of regret and confusion. I knew I had messed up, but the reality of losing Emily hit me like a ton of bricks. I had taken her for granted, believing that I could juggle both relationships without consequences. Now I was alone, and the person who had been my anchor, my rock, was gone. Sophie reached out, sensing the shift in our dynamic. She asked if I wanted to come over to talk. Part of me was tempted, longing for the comfort of her presence. But at the same time, the thought of seeing her filled me with a sense of dread. The excitement and thrill that had once fueled our encounters had evaporated, replaced by a deep awareness of the damage I had caused. When I finally agreed to see her, we met at her apartment. She opened the door, looking hesitant, as if she wasn't sure what to expect. The playful confidence she once exuded was gone, replaced by a somberness that mirrored my own. "I heard what happened," she said quietly as I stepped inside. "Emily? She's not coming back, is she?" I shook my head, feeling the weight of my actions settle deeper into my chest. "No, I don't think she is," I replied, my voice heavy with defeat. "I've tried reaching out, but she won't talk to me." Sophie's expression softened, and she took a step closer, reaching for my hand. "You know, this doesn't have to be the end. We can still—" I pulled my hand away before she could finish. "I don't know, Sophie," I said, the uncertainty in my voice unmistakable. I'm not sure if this is what I want anymore." Her eyes flashed with a mix of hurt and anger. "So, that's it? You lose her and now you're just going to walk away from me too?" "It's not like that," I insisted. I'm not in the right place to make promises right now." For a moment, she said nothing, her jaw tightening as she fought to control her emotions. "You can't just keep stringing me along, you know?" she said, her voice trembling. "I've been here, waiting for you to figure things out. And now you're telling me you don't even know if you want this?" "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to turn out this way. I never wanted to hurt anyone." Sophie took a step back, her eyes cold and distant. "Well, you did," she said. "You hurt her and you hurt me. You couldn't even make a choice, and now you're left with nothing. Maybe you deserve to be alone." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing in her apartment, feeling the weight of her words settle into my chest. I returned to the apartment I once shared with Emily. It felt like a hollow shell, filled with echoes of what once was. I wandered from room to room, haunted by memories of our life together. Photos on the wall, shared moments frozen in time. I hadn't heard from Emily since she left, and as the days turned into weeks, the reality that she wasn't coming back began to set in. I didn't know what to do with myself. Football became my only outlet, a distraction from the turmoil inside. I threw myself into training, hoping to numb the pain with exhaustion. But no matter how hard I pushed, the guilt remained. My performance on the field started to slip. Coaches noticed, teammates noticed, and soon enough, I was being pulled aside for talks about my focus and commitment. Outside of football, I was left with a social circle that had shifted in subtle but painful ways. Friends who were once close now kept their distance, some out of loyalty to Emily, others because they simply didn't want to get involved. I didn't blame them. I was the one who had brought this upon myself. Then, one afternoon, I received a message that shook me to my core. It was from Emily. My hands trembled as I opened it, half expecting a final message of closure, a definitive end to what was once our relationship. "Can we talk?" it read. My heart raced. I didn't know if this was a chance to make amends or if she simply wanted closure. Either way, I knew I had to take it. I needed to see her, to try and explain, to beg for her forgiveness if that's what it took. We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. She was already seated when I arrived, looking out the window with a distant expression. She seemed thinner, her face more drawn than I remembered. I took a deep breath and walked over to her. "Emily," I said softly, taking a seat across from her. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of pain and resolve. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "I wasn't sure if I'd ever hear from you again," I admitted, struggling to find the right words. "I'm so sorry for everything. I never wanted to hurt you." She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting down to the table. "I know you're sorry," she said, But being sorry doesn't change what happened. I trusted you, and you broke that trust in the worst possible way. I know, I said, the words feeling inadequate. If I could take it back, I would. I made a mistake, a huge one, and I've regretted it every day since. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, just stared at the coffee cup in front of her. I'm not here to punish you or to make you feel worse, she finally said. I just need you to understand that what you did, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. You chose to betray me. Her words hit like a punch to the gut. She was right, of course. I had made those choices consciously and repeatedly until there was no way back. Do you think there's any chance? I started, my voice trailing off as I realized how desperate I sounded. She shook her head slowly. I don't know, she said. Right now, I don't think I can ever look at you the same way again. But I needed to see you to say this face to face. I need to move on. And I don't know if that's something I can do with you still in my life. Her words felt like the final nail in the coffin. I could see that she meant it, that the door was closing for good. I had lost her, and there was nothing I could say to change that. After that meeting with Emily, the reality of my situation hit with full force. There was no repairing what I had broken, no fixing the shattered trust that once held our relationship together. I was left with the consequences of my choices and the wreckage they had created. Sophie didn't reach out again after our last conversation. I didn't try to contact her either. It was clear that whatever had existed between us had been consumed by the very fire it started. What began as a passionate affair had ended in a bitter realization that we had only been using each other to fill the voids in our own lives. The rest of the season went by in a haze. I did what I could to regain my focus on football, but the damage to my personal life had seeped into every part of me. I started seeing a therapist, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. I needed to understand why I had risked everything for a fleeting moment of passion, and why I hadn't stopped when I had the chance. Through the therapy sessions, I began to unpack the deeper issues that had contributed to my choices. It wasn't just about the thrill or the temptation. It was about my fear of commitment, my constant need for validation, and my inability to appreciate what I already had. I had sabotaged my own happiness out of a misguided belief that I could have it all without consequence. Bit by bit, I started to rebuild. It was slow, and at times it felt like one step forward and two steps back. I focused on my career, took better care of myself, and tried to reconnect with old friends. Some relationships were salvageable. Others were not. I had to accept that there were things I couldn't undo, people I had pushed away who would never fully come back. Months went by, and life took on a new kind of rhythm. It was different, emptier in some ways, but also simpler. I had to learn to live with the choices I made, to carry the weight of the consequences without being crushed by them. Therapy helped. It gave me a place to confront the parts of myself that I had ignored for so long. The sessions were difficult at times, forcing me to dig into the underlying reasons for my actions, but they helped me make sense of the chaos that had consumed my life. Football became my lifeline. With nothing else to distract me, I poured everything into training, trying to prove to myself and others that I could still be relied upon for something. I began to recover some of my form, finding a focus that I hadn't had in a long time. It was as if the struggle off the field had finally ignited a determination within me to prove that I could still achieve something worthwhile. But it wasn't just about football. I realized that I had to start rebuilding my life outside of the sport, even if that meant starting from scratch. I reconnected with a few old friends, explaining myself as best as I could. Some of them had heard about what happened with Emily and Sophie. Others didn't know the details but could tell that I had been through something difficult. It wasn't easy to talk about, but I found that being honest, truly honest for the first time in a long while, was freeing. I kept my distance from Emily, respecting her wish to move on. There was no contact between us, no attempt to try and rekindle what we had lost. It hurt to accept that she was gone, but I knew I had no right to pull her back into my life after what I had done. I heard through mutual friends that she had started seeing someone new, a colleague from her team's training staff. The news stung, but I couldn't begrudge her for finding happiness again. She deserved a fresh start, one that didn't include the pain I had caused. As for Sophie, There was no word from her either. She seemed to disappear from my world entirely, as if our paths had never crossed in the first place. I heard rumors that she had transferred to another team in a different city, but I didn't try to find out the details. It was better that way, cleaner. There was no sense in reopening wounds that were just beginning to heal. It was almost a year after the whole ordeal when I ran into Emily again. It happened completely by chance, at a charity event for local athletes. I had been invited as a guest speaker to talk about the importance of sports programs for underprivileged youth. It was a cause I had become more passionate about recently, perhaps as a way to find some meaning in my life again. As I was wrapping up my talk, I saw her in the crowd. She was standing near the back, talking to a few familiar faces. I hesitated, feeling a rush of emotions, guilt, longing, and something else I couldn't quite identify. For a moment, I considered slipping out without her noticing, but she looked up, and our eyes met. There was no escaping it now. She walked over, her expression calm and polite, though I could see a hint of surprise in her eyes. "I didn't know you were going to be here," she said as she approached. "Yeah, I've been doing a bit more with this organization lately," I replied, trying to sound casual. "It's good to see you, Emily." "You too," she said, a slight smile forming on her lips. There was a pause, and I wondered if she was about to excuse herself and walk away. But instead, she glanced around and then looked back at me. "Do you have a minute to catch up?" I nodded, unsure of where this conversation might go but willing to find out. We walked over to a quieter corner of the room, where the noise of the event faded into the background. "I heard you've been doing well," she said, crossing her arms lightly. "Some mutual friends mentioned you're getting back into form on the field." "Yeah, trying to stay focused," I replied. "It's been a bit of a process, but I'm getting there." She nodded, looking down for a moment before meeting my gaze again. "You seem different," she said, her voice softer now. "In a good way, I mean. It seems like you're more grounded." "I've had a lot of time to think," I admitted, "to figure out where I went wrong, and to try and be better." She gave a small, sad smile. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. "I really am. I wasn't sure if I'd ever run into you again, and I didn't know how I'd feel if I did." "How do you feel?" I asked, my heart beating a little faster as I waited for her answer. "I'm not angry anymore," she said after a moment. "I was for a long time, but I realized that holding on to that anger wasn't helping me move on. I've come to terms with what happened, even if I still don't understand why." I swallowed, feeling the familiar guilt creep back in. "I wish I could explain it," I said. "I've asked myself 1,000 times why I did what I did. It was selfish and reckless, and I don't think there's any excuse that can justify it." Emily looked at me with a thoughtful expression, as if weighing my words. "I appreciate you saying that," she said, "but you don't have to keep apologizing. We've both moved on in our own ways." Her words stung, but I knew she was right. We had both found our own paths forward, even if they didn't lead back to each other. Still, seeing her now, hearing the forgiveness in her voice, brought a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. After that brief encounter, I felt a renewed sense of determination to keep improving myself. Not for Emily, not for anyone else, but for me. It was time to let go of the past and fully commit to rebuilding my life. I started setting new goals, both on and off the field, focusing on what I could control rather than dwelling on the mistakes I'd made. I continued to work with the charity organization, finding a sense of purpose in helping young athletes who faced challenges I could only imagine. The satisfaction of giving back filled a void that I hadn't realized was there, one that football alone couldn't fill. It became a source of healing, a way to channel my energy towards something positive. Months passed, and I started to feel genuinely content with where I was. I wasn't the same person I had been a year ago. I had grown, changed, and learned from my experiences. I even began dating again, though cautiously. The first few dates were awkward, my heart not quite in it, but over time, I found myself opening up more and starting to enjoy the company of others. There was one woman, Claire, who stood out. She was smart, funny, and down to earth, with a warmth that drew me in without overwhelming me. We took things slow, and for the first time since Emily, I felt the stirrings of something real. It wasn't the all-consuming passion I'd felt with Sophie, nor was it the deep bond one once had with Emily. It was different, a quieter, steadier kind of connection. One evening, as Claire and I walked through the park, I found myself telling her about the mistakes I'd made, about Emily and the affair that had unraveled my life. I didn't know why I chose that moment to share it, but I wanted to be honest, to let her know who I was and where I came from. She listened without judgment, squeezing my hand gently when I finished. "It sounds like you've come a long way since then," she said. "We all make mistakes, but it's what we do afterward that really counts." Her words stayed with me, reminding me that while I couldn't change the past, I could shape my future. There would always be scars, remnants of the choices I made, but they didn't have to define me. I could be more than the man who cheated, more than the person who betrayed those who trusted him. Life slowly found its rhythm again, and this time it felt different in the best way possible. The past still lingered, but it didn't hold me back like it used to. It had become a part of my story, a chapter that I had finally closed. Emily and I saw each other occasionally at mutual events, always exchanging polite, friendly greetings. There was no animosity between us anymore, just an understanding that our time together was over, and we had each found our own ways to heal. As for Sophie, I never saw her again, and I never sought her out. She remained a memory, a reminder of what can happen when desire and recklessness blur the lines of right and wrong. It was better this way, better to let her be a part of my past and not my present. I continued dating Claire, and as months turned into a year, our bond grew stronger. She knew all my flaws and imperfections, yet she chose to be with me, not in spite of them, but with an acceptance that made me want to be a better man. For the first time in a long time, I was genuinely happy. I wasn't running from my mistakes anymore. I was learning from them, letting them shape me into someone I could finally respect. The journey of rebuilding was long and filled with setbacks, but each step forward was a victory. The life I had now was different from the one I'd envisioned when Emily and I were together, but it was a life I could finally embrace. I had learned that second chances weren't always about fixing the past. Sometimes, they were about finding the courage to start again, to rewrite your story and make peace with the chapters you couldn't change. As time went on, the wounds of the past gradually healed, leaving behind scars that served as a reminder of the journey I had taken. I became more comfortable with who I was and where I was going. Life didn't feel as chaotic or out of control as it had before. There was a new steadiness in my days. I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the consequences of my actions to catch up with me. I had faced them head-on and come out stronger for it. Claire and I continued to grow closer. We took things step by step, never rushing, always allowing our relationship to develop at its own pace. She had a calming effect on me, her presence bringing a sense of balance I hadn't realized I needed. With her, there was no pretense, no need to hide parts of myself. We could talk for hours about anything and everything, or sit in comfortable silence, simply enjoying each other's company. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, she brought up the idea of taking a weekend trip. "We've both been working non-stop," she said, leaning against my shoulder. "What do you say we get away for a bit? Just the two of us. No work, no responsibilities, just some time to relax." I looked at her and smiled. It sounded perfect. I hadn't taken a break in what felt like forever, and the thought of escaping the routine, even for just a few days, was appealing. "That sounds great," I replied. "Where did you have in mind? Maybe the coast?" she suggested. "A little cabin by the beach. We could take long walks, watch the sunset, just unwind." "Let's do it," I said, already picturing the salty air and the soothing sound of the waves. It would be a chance to truly disconnect and enjoy the present moment, something I had been trying to do more of lately. We booked a small, secluded cabin by the coast, far enough from the city to feel like we were in our own world. The place was rustic yet cozy, with a panoramic view of the ocean and a path leading down to a private stretch of beach. As soon as we arrived, I could feel the tension in my body start to melt away. The first evening, We took a walk along the shore as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the colors reflecting off the water's surface. I reached for Claire's hand, feeling a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the weather. It was a sense of contentment, a realization that I was exactly where I wanted to be. As we walked, we talked about the future, our hopes, our dreams, and where we saw ourselves in the years to come. It wasn't the first time we had discussed these things, but there was something about being out here, away from everything else, that made it feel more real. At one point, Claire stopped and turned to face me, her eyes searching mine. "You know," she said softly, "I'm glad we found each other. I wasn't sure I was ready to let someone into my life when we first met, but you made it easy." Her words struck a chord within me. I had often felt the same way. I hadn't been sure if I was ready to open myself up again, to take the risk of letting someone close after everything that had happened with Emily and Sophie. But with Claire, it didn't feel like a risk. It felt like a natural progression, a step toward something better. "I feel the same way," I replied, pulling her closer. "You've helped me see that there's still so much worth fighting for, even after all the mistakes." We stood there for a moment, wrapped in each other's arms, the sound of the waves lapping at the shore in the background. It was one of those rare, perfect moments when everything seemed to fall into place. After returning from our trip, I felt invigorated, as if a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. I approached both my career and my personal life with a newfound energy. Training sessions became more intense, and I found myself pushing harder, motivated not just by a need to prove myself but by a genuine love for the sport. It felt like I was rediscovering the joy that had been overshadowed by everything else. I also continued my work with the charity organization, dedicating more time and resources to it than ever before. I saw the impact it was making in the lives of young athletes, kids who were struggling to overcome their own challenges, some of which reminded me of my own past. Mentoring these kids gave me a sense of purpose that extended beyond the football field. It was fulfilling to help guide them, to offer advice and support where I could, knowing that I was giving them a chance to avoid the pitfalls I had fallen into. One day, after wrapping up a workshop for the youth program, I was approached by one of the boys I had been mentoring, a 16-year-old named Jaden. He had been coming to the sessions regularly, always with a look of determination in his eyes, but today he seemed different, more hesitant. "Coach," he said, rubbing the back of his neck nervously, "can I talk to you for a minute?" "Of course," I replied, motioning for him to sit down with me. "What's on your mind?" He took a deep breath, then looked up at me with uncertainty. "I've been having a hard time at home. My dad, he's not really around much, and my mom works all the time. I don't know if I'm good enough to do this, you know? Like, maybe I'm just wasting my time." His words hit close to home. I remembered feeling that same sense of doubt when I was his age, questioning whether I was good enough, whether the effort was worth it. "Jaden, listen to me," I said, my tone firm but gentle. "You are more than good enough. You have talent, drive, and a passion for this sport. But more importantly, you have a choice. You can let the circumstances around you hold you back, or you can use them as fuel to push yourself forward." He seemed to consider my words, nodding slowly. "But what if I mess up?" he asked quietly. "You will," I said with a small smile. "We all do. I've messed up more times than I can count, but it's not about avoiding mistakes. It's about what you do afterward, how you learn from them and grow. You've already shown that you're willing to put in the work, and that's half the battle." As he looked up at me, I could see the resolve returning to his eyes. "Thanks, coach," he said. "I'll keep trying." Around this time, I found myself thinking more about the people I had hurt, especially Emily. While we had both moved on, there was a part of me that wondered if we could ever truly make peace. Not as a couple, but as two people who had once shared a life together. I didn't want to intrude on her new happiness, but I felt there was one more thing I needed to do, something that would allow me to close that chapter for good. I reached out to Emily and asked if she'd be willing to meet one last time. To my surprise, she agreed, and we arranged to meet at a small cafe, the same one where we had talked months ago after our initial separation. She arrived looking more confident, more at peace than the last time I had seen her. As she sat down across from me, there was a different energy in the air, a kind of mutual understanding that we were no longer the same people who had once loved and hurt each other. "Thanks for meeting me," I said, feeling a bit of nervousness creep in. "I wasn't sure if you'd be interested." "It's okay," she replied. "I think there are some things we both needed to say." I nodded, taking a deep breath. "I just wanted to tell you again how sorry I am for everything that happened. I know I've said it before, but I don't think I ever fully understood how much I hurt you until I started really working on myself. I needed you to know that I'm not looking for forgiveness. I just want you to know that I regret losing you, and that I'm trying to be a better person." She listened quietly, her expression soft but unreadable. "I appreciate you saying that," she said after a moment. "I've forgiven you, you know. Not for you but for me. It was the only way I could move on and let go of the anger. I'm in a good place now, and I hope you are too." "I'm getting there," I admitted. "It's been a long road, but I'm learning." Emily smiled, a genuine warm smile that made me realize just how far we had both come. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. "I think it's time for both of us to close this chapter, don't you?" "Yeah," I agreed, feeling a sense of closure wash over me. "I think it is." We parted ways that day on good terms, knowing that whatever happened next, we were free to move forward without the shadows of our past holding us back. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was a real one. An ending that allowed for growth, for healing, and for new beginnings. With my meeting with Emily behind me, I felt a sense of finality that had eluded me for so long. It wasn't just about her forgiveness or my apology. It was the recognition that we had both changed, moved on, and found our own paths. Our story was over, but the lessons it taught me would stay with me forever. Life continued to move forward. My relationship with Claire grew stronger, and we gradually built a life together that was grounded in trust and openness. We didn't rush into anything, no grand declarations, no sudden leaps, but there was an unspoken understanding that we were committed to seeing where this would take us. She had seen me at my most vulnerable, knew my flaws, and accepted me anyway. That kind of love was steady and enduring, something I hadn't fully appreciated before. I threw myself further into my work with the charity. It became a passion that extended far beyond football. Mentoring young athletes and helping them navigate their own struggles brought a depth to my life that I hadn't expected. I saw parts of myself in those kids, the same doubts, the same need for validation. But I also saw the potential for growth, and it made me realize that if I could help even one of them avoid the mistakes I had made, then my own journey, with all its missteps, would have served a purpose. Jaden, the young athlete I had mentored, became one of my biggest success stories. Over the next year, I watched him develop into a talented player and a more confident person. He still faced challenges, but his determination never wavered. Seeing him push through those tough times reminded me of the resilience I had found within myself. Felt like a victory, not just for him but for both of us. A few months later, Claire and I took another trip, this time to a mountain cabin surrounded by towering pines. It was a place where you could see the stars at night, where the air was crisp and the world felt still. We were sitting by the fire one evening, a glass of wine in each of our hands, the warmth of the flames flickering across the room. Out of nowhere, Claire said, "I've been thinking a lot about us lately." I glanced at her, wondering where this conversation was headed. "Yeah," I replied, my tone light but curious. She set her glass down and looked at me, her eyes soft yet serious. "I'm not saying this because I'm trying to rush anything," she continued, "but I'm really happy with you. I feel like we've both come such a long way to be here together." Her words stirred something deep within me. I reached out and took her hand. "I'm happy with you too," I said, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. "I didn't think I'd find this again, this feeling, but you've given me something I didn't know I was missing." We didn't make any promises that night, didn't plan out every detail of our future. But the unspoken understanding was there, and it was enough. Whatever came next, we would face it together. Years passed, and the turbulent chapter of my life became a distant memory, a story I seldom told but never forgot. It shaped who I became, a person who had fallen, stumbled, and found a way to rise again. I continued to work with the charity, and my involvement grew, eventually leading me to start my own initiative focused on helping young athletes balance the pressures of competitive sports with mental and emotional well-being. Emily and I crossed paths from time to time, always exchanging friendly hellos. She had found happiness in her own life, as had I. There was no lingering resentment, no unfinished business between us. Just a quiet respect for the journey we had both taken to get here. As for Sophie, she remained a figure from my past. I never saw or heard from her again after she left the city, but I often thought about what her life had become. I hoped she had found peace and happiness too, away from the chaos that our affair had brought. Claire and I eventually got married in a small, intimate ceremony by the sea. It wasn't flashy or extravagant, just a few close friends, family, and the sound of waves crashing in the background. We exchanged vows that spoke of second chances and the beauty of starting over. Standing there with her, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path that had led me to this moment, despite all the pain along the way. In the end, I learned that life isn't about avoiding mistakes. It's about learning from them, growing through them, and finding the strength to rebuild. I had made choices that cost me dearly, but I also found the courage to take responsibility, to seek forgiveness, and to start anew. That was my real victory. Not a game won or a title earned, but the quiet triumph of rebuilding a life from the ashes of my own recklessness. I would always carry the scars, but they no longer defined me. Instead, they were a testament to the resilience that lay within, the ability to change, and the hope that, even after you've lost your way, there's always a path back to where you're meant to be.